So the assumption that comes to mind with the aforementioned idea seems to suggest that all natural source foods are somehow more or less equally optimal, or at least health promoting for us. There really is no rational basis for this assumption. Rather than focusing on the enormous variety of foods that might, quote, might, have a role to play in the relative health of these people groups, what if instead we distilled everything down to the common denominators between them? Weston Price also made another critical observation that in my mind reveals a much bigger implication. Amidst this enormous range of dietary preferences and foods available to all of the cultures throughout the world, whether people were living in deserts, jungles, rich fertile landscapes, or polar regions, there were two basic principles that were true for all of them. So human diets weren't just willy-nilly jerf. All primitive and or traditional diets resulting in excellent health had two things in common. They all consumed as many animal source foods as were available to them. None were vegetarian or vegan. He looked hard to find that. He couldn't find it. And number two, in every single culture, the most venerated and coveted foods of all contained extremely high levels of fat and fat-soluble nutrients.
Dr. Weston Price was a dentist and dental researcher whose search for the causes of physical degeneration and dental decay took him all over the world to live with and investigate the diets of those traditional native populations who were pictures of exceptional health. This included the Swiss, Eskimos, Polynesians, Africans, New Zealanders, and many others, but always in remote tribal communities which had remained on their traditional diets as they were still far removed from industrialized society and modern refined foods. He found that these populations continued to exhibit perfect physical and dental health into old age, and he wrote about the traditional foods that they consumed, which kept them in such fabulous condition. His book, Nutrition and Physical Degeneration, which the Foundation continues to publish and sell every year, is still the only book of its kind, and his research is still being quoted at current scientific, medical, and nutritional conferences around the world.
When Dr. Price began his travels back in the 1930s, he found degenerative disease was on the rise back then.
Price looked upon the mouth, being a dentist of course, he looked upon the mouth as being a window to the rest of the body. And because teeth were more readily accessible and easier to photograph and spot, he obviously emphasized that in his pictures. Most of Price's pictures are people with their mouths open for that very reason. But that was only the tip of the iceberg, because the high incidence of cavities was indicative not only of just poor oral health, but it was indicative of overall skeletal health and overall body health as well. Price took the foods that the societies he investigated back to his laboratory. He had samples sent back there and he analyzed them. And he found, for example, that the food values in those foods almost 10 times higher than what we have in today's diet. Our diets today are very high in omega-6s, which come primarily from grains and grain seed oils. It's a total reversal of the balance between omega-3s and 6s that Price's peoples had. The fascinating thing about the Pottinger cat studies is that in many ways they tie in with some of Dr. Price's research. Pottinger found that in the three groups of cats, which he isolated and fed diets ranging from all raw to 1/3 raw and 2/3 cooked, exhibited certain skeletal changes over the generations of the cats. The groups that were fed more of the cooked diet, less proportionally of the raw diet, started developing and showed skeletal deformities primarily in the skull itself. And this is interesting because Price found the same thing with the primitive groups that he visited when they had gone on refined foods. He also noticed, and you'll see the pictures in his book, Nutritional and Physical Degeneration, the narrowing of the jaw, the lifting of the upper palate, and the crowding of the teeth, which shows that the diet for cats that were fed the more proportions of the cooked food was not proper for that particular kind of animal. They weren't getting some of the nutrients that were needed to build proper skeletal shapes, and it was the same thing with the peoples. Now, when one looks around today, we can see a lot of evidence of the kind of diets that we have degenerated into as a society to a greater or lesser extent. And those reflect back again on what Price was talking about, and that is the more food that we use that is displacing those foods that have nutrient value, the more we are likely to be prone to things like osteoporosis and skeletal deformities and cavities in the teeth.
Why are teeth crooked? So I'm an orthodontist. I deal with crooked teeth. It's my profession. And I think it's very important to understand the cause, the etiology of what you're doing. And of course, science often starts with the question whys. But you need to ask why? It's my favorite word. Now, we have a problem, crooked teeth, and at the moment the solution seems to be straighten them. Well, we do prefer simple answers. The scientific evidence would suggest that this is an evolutionary disease. So, it's predominantly the environment with a sort of genetic flavour to it. And the vast weight of quality publications in peer-respected journals suggest that it's an environmental disease, or predominantly environmental disease. And yet we seem to be treating this as if it were a genetic disease. Now, when we look at the etiology, the cause, so you don't find malocclusion present throughout our evolution until civilization. For the masses, the average person, there was very little crooked teeth till about 250 years ago. Then you don't really see it in any of the other 5,400 species of mammals. Although interestingly, you are seeing some malocclusion present in the domesticated cats and dogs, and of course in England we have this situation with cities being infested with feral foxes that live off our waste. And we're seeing crooked teeth, aka malocclusion, within these groups. This is some images of Inuits. This was from War, who was a contemporary, interestingly, of Weston Price, who observed the Inuit population. And they're an interesting case because you have a group of Inuits who, at the stroke of a pen, became Canadian citizens. They were then eligible for social housing and food stamps. And some groups chose that option, and within 2, if not 1 generation of a purebred sample who until that point had had near ideal occlusion, you got severe malocclusion. We had a fairly constant 5%, and that harks back to that pathological group, but didn't really start until we started farming. Until we went through the second epidemiological transition, we moved from hunter-gathering to subsistence farming. And notice these 2 lines I've drawn here. The yellow lines, the Industrial Revolution. So at the Industrial Revolution, malocclusion seems to pick up notably.
Out of all the highly varied dietary practices that Weston Price studied that seemed to meet every single criteria for apparent robust physical and mental health, which people group ate a diet having the fewest moving parts? In other words, which diet supplied the fewest types of foods, clearly resulting in optimal health benefits meeting his two universal criteria? Please. Without question, the answer is the Inuit. I know you guys saw that coming. But what did the vast bulk of their diet consist of? You know, meat, fish in that order, and mostly fat with negligible carbohydrates. You know, and with this, they once enjoyed generations of superb physical structure with robust physical and mental health. Now, by no means do I conclude from this that these are the only foods any of us should be eating. You know, that's not where I'm coming from at all, far from it. But based on this deduction, and I think it's a rational deduction, it is reasonable to conclude that their diet supplied the most foundational essentials. Now, there's a key hidden foundational principle in here we can't ignore. Everything else is nuanced for better or worse. And perhaps the reason so many other cultures were able to eat and get away with certain extra dietary inclusions, like natural sugars, starches, grains, etc., had less to do with those dietary inclusions being good or optimal foods, and more to do with the fact that their universally essential human dietary foundations were solidly in place. And their health and genome, was robust enough to be able to withstand whatever compromises these additional, these dietary additions may have represented. So the relative balance was always seemingly toward health in these other cultures, but that was also a very different time. The fact is that the same foundations are foundational for us all in an extremely basic way. The rest is all nuance. I will go out on a limb, as I have been known to do from time to time, and say that fat, animal fat, is fundamentally meant to be the primary energy source and nourishment for each and every one of us. It's what our body stores and burns the most efficiently. Fat in general supplies at least twice the calories per gram that either protein or carbohydrate do, but it supplies at least 4 times more energy. And it's more even burning, clean, safe, lasting energy. It's like a form of solar energy powering our cells instead of the dirty petroleum and nuclear type fuel that sugar provides. Healthy and exclusively pastured animal fats also supply us with key fat-soluble nutrients that we critically require, that cannot be gotten realistically any other way. It's kind of incredible, actually. It's how we were best designed. It's also interesting to point out that humans are unique among all species in the capacity of our extremely unique brains to be able to run on almost nothing but ketones. Our brains can do that. Other animals can't do that. No other animal. We need to take a hint and ponder the implications of that. There's a reason for this. Why would our brains be designed to run on practically nothing but ketones when no others in the animal kingdom can do that? Well, for one thing, our brains allocate way more of our energetic resources than the brain of any other animal species. 20 to 30% of our total energy is needed for our brains versus maybe about 8% for other primates. In light of that, is an adaptation that makes, I think, perfect sense. So, and in light of the agricultural revolution, the reverse trend in human brain size also makes disturbing sense. Having gone from eating a diet that was roughly 90% animal source food in origin, according to the bulk of stable isotopic data that we have available, not just Price's work, to one that's today maybe 10%. Let's just say that the evolutionary trend isn't going quite as we'd hoped. And according to the authors in this research paper, human populations during the last 10,000 years have undergone rapid decreases in average brain size as measured by endocranial volume or as estimated from linear measurements of the cranium.
What are your thoughts on veganism? Is it sustainable?
Sure. Well, yeah, there's so much wrapped up in that question.
Yes.
Let me address it a couple ways. There are kind of 2 threads of veganism. One is that there's no moral justification for taking a life.
Mm-hmm.
That's one thing.
And they equal it to human life. And
Right. Okay. So let's deal with that one first, because that's the one that's most. It's the most. I call it an urban disease.
Mm-hmm.
It doesn't indicate a new state of cosmic awareness, on some spiritual moral plane. It actually indicates an unprecedented devolution into disconnectedness and misunderstanding of how the ecological thing works. So the fact is that the circle of life is, life, death, decomposition, digestion, regeneration, life, death, decomposition, regeneration. This is the circle of life. And the truth is, everything is eating and being eaten. And if you don't believe it, just go lie naked in your flower bed for a week and see what gets eaten. Everything is eating and being eaten. And one of the most profound spiritual foundations of understanding is to realize that without death, there cannot be life. You cannot have life without death. And so the vegan who doesn't eat animals because they don't want to kill anything, Laird Keith makes the point in her wonderful book, The Vegetarian Myth, that actually there's way more death occurring in a plant-based diet than an animal-based diet, because you are planting all these annuals, soybeans for tofu and vegetables or whatever, which is wiping out wildlife and songbirds and indigenous, whatever, that require the perennial, the prairies and the wild and the trees and all that. And so, the amount of life, from worms to bacteria to actinomycetes and whatever, that's being killed to do the tillage and the growth of the vegan diet is almost unprecedented. Now, the second thing is that when you eat a carrot, we now know that plants communicate just like animals. Now, they don't make moo, they don't say oink, but they communicate in chemical pheromones. And they respond. They respond to things. They have a language, the cellular language. So to say that because a cow has eyeballs and a carrot doesn't, means that the cow, we put additional sentience, but all of life is sentient. All of life is sentient. I mean, when the acacia trees in the Serengeti emit pheromones that make the leaves bitter as the giraffes graze, communicating giraffes are coming, they're eating, make your leaves bitter so they won't like them as well. That's sentience. When the maple tree withholds its sap in the spring, when a wind blows, because if a branch falls off, I want to be able to have a blood flow to the wound, and after the wind stops, okay, now I'll let it run in your bucket again. That's sentience. And we now know that everything is pulsing with sentience. It's not some whatever fateful inanimate thing. And so that's where we are, and the idea that you can actually sustain life without killing anything is an incredibly anti-ecological, naive idea. And then if you say, but animals are more valuable life forms than carrot life forms, then you're simply being extremely egocentric. That's the height of egocentricity on the environment. So I don't buy the moral high ground that that we can live without killing something. Vegans kill as much stuff as I do, or more, I would suggest, because when a cow eats a grass plant, it doesn't kill the grass plant. So there's actually more death there in the vegan. Now the other thread then is the nutritional one. Well, I guess there's another thread, that is that animals are inefficient. We can actually feed more people if we just did vegetables. Well, the problem with that is that vegetables extract fertility. Annuals extract fertility. Perennials increase fertility. The energy flow in the two things is different. The annual takes energy from the soil, pulls fertility from the bank account, and puts it up in a succulent, a squash, a watermelon, a seed, all right, and it's extracted. A perennial is regenerative in that it's taking the solar energy and plugging it into the soil base via carbohydrates and carbon dioxide pumping into the soil. And so that's why all of the rich soils on the planet, they didn't develop under tillage or under annuals. They developed under perennials, prairies. The pampas of Argentina, the plains of Africa, the Serengeti, the steppes of Mongolia, the Midwest of America. These are all places. I mean, even Australia had massive wombats and herbivorous kangaroos. Europe was full of great big fauna. Mastodons and all this stuff. So the great soils on the planet were developed under herbivores because of the perennial, and the perennial needs to be pruned. Just like you prune a grapevine or an apple tree, the pruning actually stimulates additional vegetable production. So to say that we could actually feed people, there is not, to my knowledge, there is not a single produce operation in the world that does it without animals. They either bring in fish meal, they bring in composted manure, something. There's not a one that I'm aware of that is animals, because there is no functional animalless ecology, because manure and urine are magic. I mean, that is nature's engine. The third thread would be nutritional. Meat's bad for you, whatever. And the problem with that is that a lot of the studies, including the China study and
Denise Minger dismantles Dr. T. Colin Campbell's The China Study.
different things have been completely proven to be unscientific, bad methodology, and now we're seeing the paleo movement and these other diets that are moving away from carbohydrates, because your body simply can't manufacture the quality of essential fatty acids, A, D, E. There are numerous of them, and enzymes that you get from meat. You can get some from vegetables, but in order to get enough, you'd have to eat 5 pounds of carrots a day, for example. And nobody's going to eat 5 pounds of carrots a day. So when I say, you can get them all from vegetables, you could if you could eat, 2 bushels of vegetables a day. And I don't know too many people that are eating 2 bushels of vegetables a day. So there's a reason why Italy, for example, last year passed a law outlawing parents feeding their children a vegan diet, because basically our brains are fat. Our brains are fat. They need that fat. And so in Italy realized, what, these parents that are feeding their kids a vegan diet, they are abusing their kids, turning them into functional, dysfunctional humans because they don't have brain development. And we're going to see more and more and more of that.